Welcome to Cedar Fort Publishing and Media Behind the Scenes. I'm Bryce Mortimer, president of Cedar Fort, and today we'll be visiting with Alonzo Gaskill. Alonzo, welcome to the show.
Bryce, thanks. Thanks for having me.
You know, it's interesting. I was just looking at a royalty record, and I just noticed that you had 29 projects with Cedar Fort. That's pretty impressive.
Well, I don't know about impressive, but I didn't realize there were that many with just Cedar Fort.
That's going to include your ebooks,
right?
As well as the physical copies.
Yeah. I'll have people ask me, how many books have you written? And I think, well, I know of 24, but you lose track at some point.
After a while.
Yeah, you just start counting, you know.
I'm not in that ballpark yet, but that's got to be a pretty good feeling. So with all these projects that you've written, I mean, surely there's got to come a point in your mind where you think, am I kind of crossing the line on some of these topics? Because you write about temples, you write about patriarchal blessings, you write about all sorts of different things like that. How do you know kind of when you're getting close to that line and how you can still kind of have your creative liberty with your writing process? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Wow, yeah. I like to think I'm not edgy, but you know, the church has evolved over the years. And so I look at, for example, the Patriarchal Blessings book that I wrote, which you guys had invited me to write. And I had thought about writing one a decade earlier. And talked about it with a couple of colleagues, and people had said, "Oh, don't do that. That's not a good thing. The church doesn't want anything like that out there." And kind of spooked me a little bit about, okay, I don't know why this would be taboo. It seems like that would be a good thing. And then when you guys came and approached me, I think by that point things had changed a bit. And you know, certain people didn't feel comfortable about something like that being written. We're more comfortable now. And so I think you've constantly kind of got to get your pulse on things. You remember we had written, I don't know if it was early this year, last year, 75 questions and answers about preparing for the temple.
Yes.
And I had been encouraged by several people, write a temple prep book. And I'd always say, I don't want to get excommunicated. Because I thought, you know, it's easy to write to members of the church who've already been through the temple and to talk about the temple because you can be clear enough but vague enough that you don't cross any lines. You're not worried about, you know, doing something that you shouldn't say. But if you're writing about the temple to people who haven't been through the temple, it's a different game, and it's a little bit more challenging. And so people had encouraged me to do it, and I hesitated. And finally we decided to do it, and we worked through the book, and you guys, helped me in that process. And we put the book out, and about a week after the book came out, Elder Bednar gives a talk in General Conference where he talks about the temple in more detail than we often do and mentions the covenants. And the funny thing about that was, of course, I was thrilled about it. My cell phone starts exploding during General Conference, during and after his talk, of people saying, "Oh my gosh, this is what your book is. This is my, this
You're
is
not going to get
right. This is validation. This is validation." And so that was a helpful thing. But there is that fear. You don't want to do something to upset anybody. And one of the challenges with writing in the church is often you know what the lines are, and you know I'm not going to cross that line, and I'm not anywhere near it. But sometimes our culture is not that way. So, for example, on
Absolutely.
that book. I was talking to a colleague of mine who's written tons of books, and dear friend, and I said, in the book I'm going to quote Ezra Taft Benson, because President Benson at BYU actually went through each of the temple covenants. And he said, "Oh, Alonzo, I would not do that. That's not appropriate." And I said, "It's not appropriate to quote one of the prophets?" And he said, I don't think we talk about that stuff. And that got me a little bit worried. But then you had Elder Bednar quoting those. Look at this very last General Conference, where President Nelson actually sat down and went through each of the temple recommend questions.
Right.
I had found references to occasional ones, but nobody going through all of it. And so I think you see a shift in our culture. And often you just really have to say, where are we as a church right now? What are the brethren talking about? And that to some degree kind of gives you a sense of, okay, you're safe here, or, you know, nobody's really talking about this. I probably ought to follow that example, even if we haven't made a specific covenant not to go there. And it's a challenging thing, because one of the things you don't want to get caught up in is writing the same book everybody's written. And when you guys invited me to write the 65 questions and answers about patriarchal blessings, my first response to the invitation was to say, there are already a dozen books out there on this. And the person from Cedar Fort that approached me said, "Yeah, but we know you'll write it differently." And so I sat down and read every one of those books that had already been written and were in print, and some that were out of print. And the thing I thought was, yeah, I would have done this differently. And that was motivation enough to go ahead then and say, let's put pen to paper and create a new approach to this. Because I felt like what I was doing, not to be critical of anybody else's work, was to keep in mind this person that's getting this blessing is going to be 13, 14, 16, 18. And a lot of the books that were written would have 15, 20-page chapters. And I'm thinking, what 14-year-old is going to plow through a 20-page chapter on, this aspect or that aspect? And so I was trying to keep my target audience in mind and writing more succinctly, more brief, responses. Anyway, it is a challenge to make sure that you're staying within lines, even if you feel like you know what those lines are, because sometimes the culture is such that members feel like the line is in a different place than you do, and you don't want to upset readers either, because that doesn't help.
All right, so recently you told me a story about a call from the Quorum of the 12 Apostles.
Yeah.
I want our listeners to hear that story.
It was an awful experience. I've written stuff on the temple, but I've written tons of books. And I come in from class, and there's a message on my voicemail. I check to see what it is, and it's a secretary from the Quorum of the 12 Apostles office. And the message that she leaves is that I need to talk to you as soon as possible about one of the books that you've written. And of course, you're automatically thinking, oh my gosh, what have I done? What book? What did I say? Here, a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles is not happy, and he's called his secretary to say, you need to give us a call. I literally was shaking. My hand was as I'm redialing the number.
Oh my heavens! I could only imagine.
Oh, it was awful, Brox. I mean, awful. And so she answers the phone and says, "Oh, thanks for getting back to me so quickly. How's your day going?" And I said, "Terrible after getting that message from you." And she said, "Oh no, this is a positive call. This is a positive call." But the fear was, again, if the 12 are calling me, I've done something wrong, because why else would you call Alonzo?
Right.
And it turns out that a member of the 12 had received a borrowed copy, a loaned copy of one of my books. The person had taken the book back, and he liked the book and wanted to copy the book. And so that's all that it was.
What a relief.
It was a remarkable relief. But I got to tell you, I had 5 minutes of real fear thinking, what in the world have I said?
So did you sign the copy as you sent it to them?
My wife kept saying, you need to autograph it. And I said, she didn't ask me to autograph the book, and that feels kind of arrogant all of a sudden.
Oh, come on, you had a chance.
And the funny thing was, she said, how much do I owe you? And I said, I'm not going to charge a member of the 12 for a copy of a book. So, I didn't. If she had asked me to sign, I would have signed it. But the thought of me being so arrogant as to thinking, oh, you'll probably want my signature in this, I didn't do that.
Well, it's interesting because I think sometimes as members of the church, you don't really have that perspective sometimes that a member of the Quorum of the 12 could be affected by something that you had written.
Yeah. I had a colleague that I bumped into in the hallway. He'd written a book, and President Uchtdorf, when he was serving the first presidency, sent him a letter, just on letterhead, thanking him for the book and signing it. And I thought, not only was it wonderful to know that the book had impact, as this brother learned, but to think that a member of the first presidency would be so gracious to say,
take the time out of their day.
This meant so much to me that I just wanted you to know this. And I've seen that from Elder Holland over and over again. I can't tell you how many people I know that have had those kinds of exchanges with him also. I know a number of the brethren just are remarkably gracious in that sense. And you know that they're reading stuff like that. Even in this last General Conference, one of the brethren had referred to a BYU scholar and his writings, and in a positive way. And I just thought it's incredible to know that the things that some are writing are having even enough reach that the brethren are reading some of those things.
One of my favorite pictures is looking at one of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles' offices, and in the background you can see his bookshelf. And I scanned through and looked at all the different ones that have Cedar Fort Publishing's logo on the back of them, and it's just that sense of wow, it really does make a powerful impact in the world, even in their offices.
And frankly, to be the president of Cedar Fort and to recognize, to be aware that the work that you're doing is significant enough that it's landing in the office and in the minds and in the hearts of those who preside over this work. I mean, what does that say about how great the things you're doing are, the impact that Cedar Fort has? It's a remarkable thing.
Thank you. Okay, so I want to take just a minute and let's shift directions for just a second, because here you've written books on the temple, on patriarchal blessings, and many, many other different types, symbols of the temple. Out of all these titles, which ones do you think, what are the ones that kind of raise to the top that you think this is a really good one that makes a very powerful impact in people's lives? A lot of people aren't familiar here, and this is going to make a positive impact.
That's challenging. I think I'm sometimes surprised what book has impact in someone else's life and then another book in another person's life. The first book I wrote was Lost Language of Symbolism. And in that one, I kind of was a fluke. I was speaking at Education Week, giving 4 lectures on symbolism, and a couple of publishers approached me and asked me to write the book. And that kind of got me writing. I hadn't written any books prior to that time. I don't know how many books after that. I wrote a book called Odds Are You Going to Be Exalted? Evidence the Plan of Salvation Works. And that seems to have had significant impact. The first book I did with Cedar Fort was a book called Sacred Symbols, Finding Meaning in Rites, Rituals, and Ordinances. And I was worried that that one wouldn't be as impactful because it was a little bit more heavy. I was doing some pretty heavy research, but that was one where I really wanted to look at temple symbolism, but I really became conscious I didn't want to cross any lines. And so what I tried to do was go back and find ancient rituals, primarily Judeo-Christian, but some outside of the Judeo-Christian tradition, that looked, in many cases, identical to what we do in the temple. And to be able to send those out in the book and say, here's an interesting ritual, and then talk about the symbolic implications, knowing that an endowed member of the church would read that, make the connection, see what it was without me having to make that, and find it had some impact. Even the book that you and I did together, The Truth About Eden. Likewise, those two temple books, those last two that I just mentioned, I've had email after email after email from people saying, these have completely changed the way I see temple worship. You know, I struggled to go and find that I got anything out of it. I'd go out of duty or out of obligation, but I wasn't getting much revelation. But those books caused people to have this aha, where not only were they beginning to understand things they'd not understood anymore, but also they were realizing that this had given them tools so they could go beyond what I had given to start now seeing things that were going on in the temple, that were being taught, that they had previously missed because they felt more equipped to do it. And so I think to some degree, I've had a passion about temple stuff and written a lot on the temple because I believe that is remarkably important. As covenant Latter-day Saints, we've got an obligation to understand it. And frankly, Bryce, sometimes I worry a little bit about the fact that we're so casual about the temple. One, a lot of people don't go as much as they should. But another thing I found is you'll have people who will go for years and years and years and feel no obligation to figure out what is this about. And presuming that this is God's kind of most important stuff for us, these are the highest covenants we'll make. This is God trying to speak to us in symbolic ways to share some message. And then to have somebody go for 30 or 40 years with regularity and always say, well, I just try and enjoy the Spirit. I have no idea what God's trying to say. It almost seems irresponsible. And it certainly has to limit the blessings that we're receiving. And so for me, writing on the temple has been a little bit of a passion. I think I've written 5 or 6 temple books, but all in the hopes that I would get people having an experience in the temple where they wanted to go back more often because now it was starting to be meaningful. They were starting to get revelation. It was more impactful. And I feel like the temple books have in many ways helped to do that.
You know, it's interesting. My brother-in-law just went to the temple for the first time, and he spent some time with the president of the temple where he explained some of the symbolism of the robes. And I had never heard any of that. I thought, wow, had I known what some of the symbolism was, that could definitely change the way that I perceive the temple. And I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
Your listeners, when they kind of connect the dots on a few things, it makes that impact in their ritual and their worship.
So just as an example or two, you think in many cultures you notice that veiled women are women that are oppressed, right? So the veil has often been used as a means of oppressing women or at least causing women to feel oppressed. The burqa that you see in countries like Afghanistan certainly has had that kind of impact or that impression. And so I've seen some women who would then transpose what goes on in the temple and women wearing veils there and have some sense that this felt like a symbol of oppression. So you take Paul, for example, talking about veils on women in prayer, requiring that the angels then acknowledge their authority or their power, that ancient priestesses often wore veils. And so this connection of this being a symbol of a woman's power, a woman's ability to contact God, to connect with God, the angels having to acknowledge her authority. But because of outside the church in the world, it often being a negative symbol, I think a lot of women felt like wearing a veil in the temple was somehow suggesting they were being oppressed or submissive or whatever, when it didn't carry that connotation for us. I remember reading once, a number of years ago, President John Taylor talking about we tie bows in order to suggest we're in a covenant relationship with the bridegroom, Christ. Well, what do we say in our contemporary culture? A couple are getting married. They're tying the knot. That phrase comes from ancient temple worship. And so the concept is that you and I go in the temple and we tie bows, and the symbolism is that we're now in a covenant relationship where we're intertwining our lives with God and Christ. And now we are the bride, and Christ is our bridegroom, and there's going to be power that's going to come and support that's going to come to us because of that covenant relationship that tying these bows symbolizes. And so often we put on these articles of clothing, but we don't think about why we do it. And so then it has no impact. And it's that way with any symbol. Jacob Neusner was this prolific Jewish scholar. He died, I think, 2 years ago this month. And Neusner had written more than 500 books, okay? Wow. Remarkable guy. Neusner talked about the need to endow symbols with meaning. And he basically said, if you don't endow a symbol with meaning, it's not impactful. And so, you can wear a CTR ring on your hand, but if you haven't endowed that with meaning, if you don't think about choosing the right when you look at it, it's a piece of jewelry. You can wear temple garments, but if they don't remind you of your covenants and the flesh of Christ, Hebrews 10:20, then they have no power, right? They're just underwear. And so consequently, you and I have to be more systematic as we go to the temple in endowing every symbol, whether it's the gestures or the words or the story or the clothing, with meaning, or these things just become very mundane and boring and repetitive. And so God's offering us power and information. I mean, deep and profound information. But it requires that we pay a price. Nobody would assume that you could understand the book of Revelation or the book of Ezekiel by a casual one-time through reading, right? And yet somehow we think, if God wants me to understand the temple, he's just going to tell me. No, if you want to understand Isaiah or Ezekiel or the book of Revelation, you'd buy some commentaries and you'd really study and try and figure it out. We have to be that way oriented toward the temple. We have to spend more time thinking about it, talking about it, trying to figure out what's going on. When I was first married, I'd go to the temple, but honestly, not too far into it, Bryce, I thought, yeah, I pretty much get all this. And so then it was boring because I was thinking, I don't want to go back. I already know it. I can quote it for you. And my wife kept pushing, we need to go to the temple every week. We need to get out to the temple. We started going more often. At one point, I thought, you know what, God, if I'm going to keep doing this, I'm going to figure this stinking thing out. Something's going on here. There's a puzzle. And I sat down and just started making notes of what is this about? What's that about? And then started researching and digging and started finding stuff and realizing, oh my gosh, this is this profound and detailed and delicious puzzle. But I have to pay a price to figure it out. And as I did that, God started to open windows. Revelation started to come. I started to find stuff as I was researching. And I began to get almost possessed by the temple, in a positive sense, by satanic demons. No, but getting possessed by the spirit of it and the information and thinking, God has got so much stuff to share with us here. I want to get this. I want to figure it out. Anyway, and that really changed my temple worship.
Thank you for sharing all of that information. I want to help our listeners understand a little bit more about your background, because I think that really paints a picture of who you are and why ritual and worship has been so important in your life. So tell us just a little bit about your background. Well,
for many years, I was the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. Just kidding. Just kidding. I'm sorry. I grew up just outside of Independence, Missouri, in the Greek Orthodox Church. Very active for almost 2 decades. My parents had kind of fallen into inactivity. We'd moved when I was about 6 years old and lived a fair distance away from the most or the nearest Orthodox church. But I reactivated myself, started going, was very engaged, served as an altar boy. I remember one Sunday the priest saying we should read the Bible because that wasn't really something that we typically did. So I came home and asked my parents, do we have a Bible? Well, we don't have a Bible. So I went out and bought a Bible, started reading that. And loved the church. I love the ritual. I love the mysticism of all of it. In the Orthodox Church, you worship with all 5 of your senses. And so you're hearing the chanting, you smell the incense, you see the icons, you taste the bread and the wine. You touch the icons and the bread and the priest and so it's very sensory. And I was drawn to that. They're very good about creating every Sunday kind of a mystical experience. And it was powerful. And I love the church. I did kind of annoy the priest a bit because as I started reading the Bible, I started coming up with theological questions. Well, gee, we do this or we believe that, but this seems to say that. What's the deal? I remember the priest saying to me one Sunday as we were putting on our robes, our vestments for services.
And you're at what age at this point?
I'm probably about 15, 16.
Okay.
And he kind of said, Lambros, my name in Greek, Lambros, you need to stop asking so many questions. You just need to have more faith. And I wasn't trying to challenge stuff. I just wanted to understand, right? I just wanted to understand. And so I went away to college. I wanted to be a mortician. Always, wanted to be an undertaker. Just thought that was the greatest thing. And there was no Greek Orthodox church. So I started going with my roommates to the Catholic Church. And then I thought, you know what? I'll just go to a different religion every week. Campus Crusade for Christ, the mosque, the synagogue, just a little bit of everything. And I had a couple of experiences. One is I was at a Campus Crusade for Christ meeting, a bunch of us just sitting around in a circle. We were actually talking at the time about our favorite movie, and mine happened to be a movie about the Archbishop of Canterbury. Okay, so how weird am I, right? And so at one point we're sitting in this circle talking. They're probably 20, 30 kids, I don't know. And I make a joke slamming Mormons, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It was brilliant. I know that because there was sustained laughter, right? I wish I could remember what the joke was. But the point, Bryce, was this. The second I said this, and all of these people just bust a gut, I was physically enveloped with kind of this dome of darkness. Like I could feel it, like the Spirit of the light of Christ saying, I'm not happy with what you just said. I went to a high school that had about 4,000 kids in it, and I knew 6 LDS kids in that whole high school. And they were remarkable. They stood out. They were different. Just really great people. And I think the light of Christ may have been saying to me, you've always thought these are some of the best people you've ever known in your life. And here you've chosen to mock them just for the sake of, being funny. And that struck me. I couldn't figure out at the time what it was about, but it just struck me that God somehow wasn't happy that I had made this joke mocking these remarkable people. Anyway, I was going across campus one day. I see an LDS Institute of Religion building, and I thought, oh, my friend Ken goes to that church. I had to try that one also. So Monday afternoon, went and pulled on the doors. Of course, the building was locked. Started to walk away, and this girl who was the Relief Society president in the student ward came to the door and invited me in. We went in and sat down on an orange couch because in the 70s and 80s, everything was orange in the church. We must have got it on sale or something. And so we're sitting on this couch chatting, and 15, 20 minutes into it, she says, oh, you're not LDS, are you? And I said, oh, no, Greek Orthodox. And she said, what are you doing tonight? No, nothing romantic, don't misunderstand. But she said, what are you doing tonight? And I said, I don't know why. And she said, we do this family home evening. Have you ever heard of family home evening? And I said, yeah, I had a bad experience with that once. And she said, well, why don't you just come with us? We're just going to do homemade ice cream and play some board games. So I went to the thing and I had a great time. We played a lot of board games. I won everything. I'm pretty good at games, but honestly, how pathetic are we, right? Hey, maybe if we make the Greek Orthodox kid, let him win everything, he'll want to be part of us. So I felt like they were throwing the game, but we finished that up and getting ready to go, and one of them said, what are you doing on Wednesday? I don't know, why? We're doing a service project. Would you be willing to help out? Yeah, I can do that. After the service project, what are you doing Sunday? I don't know, why? Well, why don't you come worship with us? Well, I go to a different religion every week. Well, come join with us. Okay, I can do that. Well, before long, they're kind of doing this Monday, Wednesday, Sunday, reeling me in, So I started talking to the missionaries. We didn't do missionary discussions, but we mostly just talked anti-Mormon literature because I was pretty antagonistic toward the church, or at least anti about some of the things I thought I knew. And in the process of all of that, I basically accidentally had a spiritual experience and realized, oh heavens, what have I done? This is true. I know that this is true. And that changed the entire direction of my life. I mean, in every way. It caused a terrible rupture between my parents and I that lasted for several decades. I ended up going on a mission a year later, which probably was not good timing because they weren't over the fact that I'd converted, and that made things worse. While I was on my mission, I decided I wanted to teach religion for a living instead of being a mortician. So that changed the direction occupationally, but it also
where'd
changed.
You serve your mission?
London South Mission. So England.
I was in London.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Very good.
Yeah, good to see.
Yeah. And so, it changed what I studied in college. It really changed everything. And remarkable blessing. If you were to have asked me 50 years ago, where are you going to be 50 years down the road? This would not have been what I had thought. There was even one point at which I wondered about the priesthood, meaning being a Greek Orthodox priest. So I've always been kind of a spiritual person from my childhood, but God had plans I didn't have, and took me down roads that were not
But
part
you're
of the
saying
plan.
that's what changed that's what helped you see that you wanted to be a teacher and teach religion.
Yeah, ironically, get this. My freshman year, planning on being a mortician, the university required that all of us do this kind of entrance little thing where you filled out this survey, and then it would tell you what you should study. And I got out of high school and thought, I know I got to go to college. I got to get an education so I can provide. But I want to get out of school as soon as I can and never be back. At the time, I often found myself bored in school. So I fill out this thing that they required all the incoming freshmen to do, and then they give you the report, and it said, you should be a teacher. And I was like, I have proven that these things don't work. Not only had I never thought about being one, but I emphatically had zero interest in teaching. I mean, zero. And so I thought, this is just a joke. They're wasting their time having people do this. And then, look where we are 30 years into the career, and that's what I do.
So I remember you telling me at one point, when you had first joined the LDS church, you felt like it was boring in a way. because you came from this background of rituals and the LDS Church didn't have it.
Yeah. So I loved the doctrine. When I discovered the restored gospel and the doctrine, I was drawn to that. One of the things that I loved the most was the idea of modern prophets and apostles. I had read anti-Mormon literature, and so I had a lot of wrong ideas about Joseph Smith, and I was struggling with that. And the missionaries took me to see General Conference. This is back when you go to the Stake Center and watch it via satellite. And Spencer W. Kimball was the prophet, and he gave a talk, and I remember thinking, I could believe this man is the prophet of God. You know, I could feel something when he spoke, and I was impressed by that. And as I began to study the teachings of the church, I was drawn to the doctrine. I love this idea of modern prophets and apostles. As a matter of fact, the missionaries brought me the Book of Mormon, and I did like everybody. I stagnated with the Isaiah chapters and was like, oh my gosh, just shoot me. But I heard about the Doctrine and Covenants, and I said, what is this? I'd read something that spoke of the Book of Commandments, right? I said, what is this? So it's called the Doctrine and Covenants. And it's a book of revelations from Joseph Smith and some of his successors. And I was like, how do I get that? There's no LDS bookstore where I was in Missouri. How do I get that? And they were like, oh, well, we can see if we can. And I had to ask them 3 or 4 times. I just wanted a paperback copy of this book, but I think they didn't want to spring for the $2 or whatever for it. I'd have paid for it if they'd have just told me. Because for me, this idea of a book of modern revelations was just wow. And so I got that and just ate that up. And then got back to the Book of Mormon. Of course, now I'm absolutely in love with the Book of Mormon. But that really drew me. So the challenge I ran up against was, here I am going to the Orthodox Church where you've got all of the chanting and the candles and the icons and the fine twilled linen, the robes and the incense. And it's such a remarkably stimulating encounter every Sunday. And then I go into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, where our Sunday services in the chapel, there are no pictures, certainly no chanting, no incense, no candles. And, the bishop is up there giving a talk, and he's wearing a brown suit and looks like a beetle. And I don't mean one of the pop group. I mean, he looked like an insect. And for me, I'm just watching this whole thing and thinking, how in the world can this be true? It's so foreign to everything I've experienced for 20 years as a Christian. And it just, the worship forms were hard. And so I loved the content. I loved the doctrine. But every Sunday I'd go to sacrament meeting and think, man, this is rough going. A year later, I received my endowment in the Salt Lake Temple. My best friend baptized me, but I ended up becoming an elder before him, so I ordained him an elder. We received our mission calls the same day, received our endowments together in Salt Lake Temple. So he grew up in the church. We go to the Salt Lake Temple, receive our endowment, and I'm like, okay, church is true now. There's the ritual, there's the symbolism, there's the icons, meaning all the art and the painting and the on the walls and the robes. And then I thought, now we're there. My best friend says to me, this is not the same church, because he was so kind of symbolically illiterate and had not experienced anything like that. So for him, his initial encounter with the temple was, this is really weird, it's different. For me, it was like, oh, I've come home. Now I'm okay. And here's the other thing, ironically, is I've gone back, obviously, numerous times to the Orthodox Church in the years since my conversion. I spent the last 10 days in Greece, just got back from a nearly 2-week trip to Greece, visiting some monasteries and churches and temples and all kinds of stuff like that. But that upbringing, that culture really made me sensitive to symbols and the beauty of symbolism, the power of symbolism. But as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, our typical Sunday experience is not very symbolic or very ritualistic. And so often then the temple feels foreign unless we really have thought a lot about symbols before we've gone to the temple, and unless we continue to think symbolically, once we've received our endowment. So for me, it was something I really needed, and it kind of brought back something that I think has been part of most religious traditions for millennia. But because the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints grows up in a very Protestant milieu, we look pretty Methodist, And so consequently, a lot of those symbolic things just were not part of worship when I first joined in Sunday worship. And for me, it was stimulating to get back and to get to something that I felt like met my need. And so I love the temple because of that. It felt like my Greek Orthodox experience was meaningful. And the point I was going to make earlier was, now when I go back to the Orthodox Church, and even shortly after receiving my endowment, I begin to look at things that I never really understood as a practicing Orthodox Christian and say, oh my gosh, because of the temple, now I see what's going on here.
Do you have any examples of what those would be?
Well, you have things, for example, in the marriage between a husband and wife in Orthodoxy. First of all, the Orthodox talk about how marriage is not just for life, it's for eternity. The Orthodox have a doctrine of theosis, the notion that God is going to divinize you. He's going to make you like he is. But when you watch an Eastern Orthodox marriage, they have these laurel wreath crowns that they wear, and they have these ribbons that come off of them, and they're placed on the head, and kind of switch back and forth. And this idea that it's the crowning of the bride and groom, that they are becoming a king and a queen, a priest and a priestess. So this ribbon connects them together so that they're no longer and never to be separated again. And that kind of thing. Some of the clothing that is worn, the robes that have the connections. Even the layout sometimes, as you see in temples of various traditions that mirror ours, but these are things that, certainly Joseph Smith would have been unaware of. And so my point being that in many ways, having received my endowment, things that before I didn't really get now had more meaning, more impact,
Absolutely. So we could go many different directions right here, because here you've got this wealth of knowledge and all this experience and had a lifetime of teaching. And you're the world religion professor at BYU, so you have all this background and knowledge. I'm wondering if we can spend a minute talking about some of the symbols of the temple that you cover in one of your books, and maybe talk about some of the things that maybe the average person wouldn't catch or realize that would improve their temple worship if they understood some of these things.
Yeah, maybe I could preface it with an experience I had. I was living in Oakland. Well, I was living in Palo Alto, California, but near Oakland. Oakland was our temple. And the temple president at the time there said to me that when President Hinckley was first made president of the church, he went out and met with temple presidents and gave some counsel. And one of the bits of counsel he gave was, he said, we often have people say to us, why don't the brethren just tell us what it means? Just tell us what the temple symbolism means so we'll know. And he said, President Hinckley said, there are a number of reasons why we don't do that. But one of them is this. We don't want to rob people of the opportunity to get revelation in the temple. Because there's something really impactful if you've experienced this, where you're trying to figure something out and the Spirit whispers to you a meaning, and you're like, wow, oh my heavens, I never noticed that, I see it, etc. And President Hinckley suggested that if we, as the brethren, tell you what everything means, two things happen. One is you lose that opportunity of having the spiritual experience of the temple being a house of learning, getting revelation. The other problem, he said, is we shut down the potential for any additional application, meaning I know there are things in the temple, Bryce, that when I first joined, when I first started going, had one meaning to me. And over time, that has developed into something bigger and bigger and bigger. And you begin to see more in it. But if you limit by saying it means this, period, then the risk you get into is it limits the Spirit's ability to reveal to people beyond that. Because we tend to say, oh, Elder so-and-so, this general authority said it means that. So that's all that it means. And one of the things that's so remarkable about the temple is that it continues to feed you over and over and over again, more and more and more, the more you go. And as your life circumstances changes, it can give you new revelation. We often talk about the Christocentric nature of the temple, meaning it's really Christ-centered. And if you were to give somebody counsel before they went to the temple about what to do to try and take things in, perhaps one of the best things we could say is, look for Jesus. Look for Jesus in the temple. Not simply, ooh, there's a person that's dramatically acting as Jesus is in the play or the video, but look for things that can remind you of Christ. Because when all is said and done, the point of the endowment certainly at least is this, to make it possible for you and I to become like Christ, and through Christ, return and live with God, right? So good thing to look for. But I was thinking at one point, Elder Bruce R. McConkie, the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, talked about the three pillars of eternity, the creation, the fall, and the atonement. And I thought, I don't know why he thinks that's so profound. That didn't seem like that big of a deal to me, but he seemed to really emphasize it. And then it struck me one day, well, but that's the endowment, isn't it? So you and I are told the story of the creation in the endowment, where God takes chaos, he takes the cosmos and he organizes it. Our word cosmetics comes from the same root word as cosmos. It means to organize. So the reason we call cosmetics is because the person putting on makeup is organizing their face, right? And so God takes the chaos in the world and he organizes all of this chaos and creates this ordered universe and this ordered earth for us. And then he gives this to us as a gift. We get this paradise, this Eden, and he plants us on it. But then immediately after we're told that story, we're told in the temple the story of the fall, where you and I screw everything up because symbolically it's the story of our fall, not Adam and Eve, but we symbolically represent Adam and Eve. And we see that we listen to Satan and we reintroduce chaos into our lives. So God ordered the chaos and made it usable, so now it's this beautiful cosmos. Then we automatically reintroduce chaos by listening to Satan. And the point of the endowment is to get you and I now out of that through making covenants with Christ that will ultimately lead us back to God's presence. Well, the last thing that we do in that whole experience is we act out the judgment day. And we have a conversation with God about the things that we've learned. And there's a veil or a curtain hanging between us and the person who represents Heavenly Father. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 20 tells us that veil is Jesus. And so I communicate with God through Christ. And I interact with God through Christ. And Christ is mediating this whole thing, kind of like in section 45 of the Doctrine and Covenants, standing between me and God. And yet, ultimately, in that whole kind of symbolic judgment day that we act out, I don't have what's required. Those of you who've been through the temple know you come up short. You're not able to convey the answers to all the things that you're asked. And so, technically speaking, the end of the endowment has this message of, sorry, you didn't make it. You fail. You don't have what's required to get in God's presence. But then in what Hugh Nibley called this remarkably intimate act, God gives you what you don't have, brings you into the celestial room of the temple, symbolically into His presence. And thus the message of the endowment ends up being about grace. God created this perfect earth. You and I screwed it up by listening to Satan. We enter into covenants with Christ. He mediates our judgment with God. And, section 45, you've got Jesus saying, listen to Him who did no harm, who did thy will, who was perfectly obedient. And now I'm asking you, God, to forgive them, you, Bryce, and me, Alonzo, and all of God's children, of our sins, because Christ was obedient. And we're not, but Christ is willing to pay for that. And so the whole thing is really about this grace, so much so that if Hebrews 10:20 is right, that the veil of the temple is Jesus, then the person that is judging you, symbolic of Heavenly Father, can't see anything but Jesus when he does that. He chooses to completely obscure you by this symbol of Christ, so that really, literally, when I am judged, Jesus is blocking the view of my brokenness, my sinfulness, my fallenness, and all God sees is Christ. What a remarkably beautiful thing. And to know every time I go to the temple, that message is sent that Christ is standing there before me, mediating and making sure that God sees Him rather than Alonzo and all of his inadequacies.
I love that. Yeah, I hadn't heard of that perspective before, but I think that really brings a lot of meaning to those last stages there in the endowment. And what a great way. I mean, those are the types of things I'm talking about when you think, what are some of those symbols that you've seen? And I get that obviously there's so much more that can be, revealed in the temple of learning or the house of the Lord, where it's a place of learning. But it's great to be able to have some of these ideas so that when you go, you can expound upon that and focus. That's one of the things you hear is make sure stay attentive, and making sure that you're focusing on some of these things that can allow for the Spirit to then reveal to you some of these truths.
Absolutely.
I really liked that. I heard you once talk about Adam and Eve and some of their experiences in the garden, and I know I'm throwing you on the spot with all of this stuff, by the way.
Yeah, the listener should know there was no prep here. Okay? This is free flow of thought.
That's right. And that's and I like to do that a lot of times because it allows us to kind of have an open dialogue where we're off script and we can be able to see what are some of the things that kind of flow freely to a degree. But there was a time that I heard you once speak about Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, some of the experiences there. Can you expound on anything with the Garden of Eden that some of our listeners might say, oh, aha, here's another gem with Adam and Eve, and something that I might not know about them. Maybe it's with the garments, maybe it's with the fruit, maybe it's with their perfection, whatever it might be. But if you could give us some...
Throughout Scripture and throughout history, you've got this model of the bride and the bridegroom. And so the bridegroom is Christ. The bride is His church, Covenant Israel. And that's really depicted in the endowment. It's been depicted in the sealing ceremony until recently, where it isn't about you and your spouse or me and my spouse, but it's about this relationship between Christ and His bride. And so men traditionally have represented in the endowment, because it's a play, the role of God or Christ or their prophets. Women have typically represented the church, male and female. And so as you watch the interaction between Adam and Eve, you see the symbolism of Christ and His church. So for example, in the story, the woman is deceived by Satan. The man isn't. Satan first comes to Adam, and Adam won't buy into it. So then he goes to Eve, and she's deceived, right? And so then Adam leaves paradise to redeem the woman. Well, this can seem remarkably sexist, but it's not about men and women, okay? It's about the fact that Lucifer would tempt Jesus. It's about the fact that Lucifer would tempt Jesus, and Jesus would say, absolutely not. I'm going to obey Father. But Lucifer can come to the bride of Christ, you and me, male and female, and what happens? He tempts us, we're enticed, and we partake. And so it isn't a statement that Eve screwed up, because we know Mother Eve didn't. It's a statement that you and I as Christ's bride screw up constantly. And so Jesus has to leave paradise, symbolically represented by Adam, to redeem his bride, symbolically represented by Eve, because we messed up. Not women, but men and women constantly get sucked into Satan and introduce chaos in their lives because of it. And so Christ willingly leaves to come and redeem us, protect us, and help us back. And so, I've talked to people who thought, it seems like it's painting women bad and men good. And I say, it's not about that. When women had their faces veiled, it wasn't a symbol that they were in subjection or they were less. But if I'm the bride of Christ, and my face is veiled, whether I'm female or male, what it's really saying is the Lord and his prophets see clearly. But I, male and female, the bride of Christ, do not. So you better hook up with the Lord's prophet and the Lord and follow them, because they're not laboring under a veil like you and I are. They see what we can't see, and they will lead us safely back to the celestial kingdom. When we talk in terms of making covenants in the temple, we may make covenants together as a group, but all covenants are individual. I don't make covenants to any person in the temple. So when men or women are sealed in the temple, you make covenants to God about the spouse. You don't make covenants to the spouse. Therefore, if you're faithful to your covenants, but your spouse is not, that doesn't keep you from being saved, right? And I think too often we have thought the model that was being presented was women are somehow subservient to men, men preside over, etc. Instead of looking at this and saying a man may have a responsibility to preside in love and righteousness in the home, but he's to do that in combination with or in concert with or alongside of his wife, counseling and discussing. And any idea of women being less is misunderstanding the message. The message of the endowment and the placement of Adam and Eve was to say, you need to consider yourself as if you're Adam and Eve, and men are going to play one dramatic part and women are going to play another, but the women are representing all of us, male and female, and the men have simply been assigned to represent Jesus and his prophets. And therefore, Jesus and the prophets see clearly. Men and women together struggle to see what God sees, what his prophets see. And that's why we make bad choices. That's why we need Christ to redeem us. That's why Jesus needed to come here and leave paradise when he had a right to stay because he'd been faithfully obedient. But you and I, not so much. Is that what you're talking about?
Absolutely. I mean, I just wish we could listen to you all day long.
Oh, you're kind. You're kind.
No, really. I love listening to this. I mean, it just adds more perspective. I mean, I would consider myself a very active, faithful member of the church, the best of my ability. And yet it's just wonderful to be able to hear these, the added symbols on some of these things to give perspective.
Forgive me for interrupting you. David O. McKay is said to have made a comment near the end of his life that, I'm just beginning to understand the temple. And I've heard people actually say, well, if the prophet didn't get it until his 90s. I
hear it all the time.
I don't need to worry about it. And I think...
And they almost use it in the sense of, so I don't have to worry
exactly.
about.
Yeah, and my response tends to want to be, that's fine. Yeah, you don't have to worry about having blessings. If you don't want to think about this and you don't want to understand it and you don't want to contemplate it, that's completely fine. But the impact this is going to have in your life will be limited then. The degree to which you pay a price for God to reveal to you and explain to you and help you to understand is the degree to which you're going to get what's going on. If you want to go for 30 years sporadically and not really get much out of it, you have a right to do that. But when we talk about the endowment being an endowment of power, it becomes that when you begin to understand it. So what did the First Presidency counsel the young missionaries to do? As soon as you get your mission call, get yourself to the temple, receive your endowment, go as often as you can, perhaps serve as an ordinance worker till you get out into the mission field. I had a son. He gets back in 7 days from his mission. He's serving in Greece. He took that counsel. Before he received his endowment, he did baptisms for the dead every Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday morning before he went to school, and just did that consistently for ages. Then he received his endowment, became an ordinance worker, worked 2 days a week in the temple, and he fell in love with the temple, and the temple was powerful to him. But then he goes off to a mission where there's no temple, and so for 2 years he's not going to have an opportunity to attend. But the reason his covenants can have power is he spent enough time engaging in them that they begin to have meaning. So then he could go out in the mission field and carry with him the meaning of the endowment. But too often what ends up happening is a young man or a young woman receives their mission call, let's say they've got 2 months before they go, and they think, okay, well, I'll receive my endowment when Grandma Jerusha can come down from northern Idaho, and Grandma Jerusha can come down a week and a half before they leave on their mission. And so they postpone it and postpone it. So then they go to the temple once or twice before they go on their mission, and they're thinking this is going to be an endowment of power, that this is going to somehow really protect them and inspire them and empower them. It doesn't work that way. You have to turn it into that, and that requires paying a price. And that means we go, and we think, and we ponder, and when we're in the temple, we're thinking and praying about it, and when we leave, we continue to study it. If we're going to be lazy Latter-day Saints, if as members of the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, we're not going to really engage in the stuff, then we should expect that the stuff is going to bring back limited blessings to us. And I don't mean that condescendingly or critically. I'm just simply saying, I've been on both sides.
Well, you bring up a mission, okay, and we have a book by David Covey where he talks about the highly effective missionary.
Yeah.
And one of the things in there is learning skills. And sometimes in missionary work, people put skill with being kind of deceiving or con man because you've learned your skills. And I think that there's some parallels here that, no, it has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with you're only going to be effective as you're prepared.
Right.
So, for instance, in the book, David has this parallel of the field. Imagine a field that's all ready to harvest, and you have somebody sitting there with scissors. You're cutting it down with scissors versus a big machine that goes through and efficiently cuts it down.
Yeah.
Both operated by an individual, but to what degree or what effectiveness are you really going to endow yourself? Well, not endow yourself with, but
be endowed with.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. Do you have anything in your mind that you would want to share with our listeners that you think, hey, this would be a fun topic to be able to talk about?
I don't know if this is interesting, but I'm going to say it just because it's on my mind, okay? And then maybe if we've got a minute or two, we can go down another road. So I flew to Europe, spending time in Greece, as I said, and as I'm flying out, I took a couple books to read on the airplane. At one point, I got up to use the restroom, and a woman who was sitting kind of kitty corner from me was also standing there, and she said, Are you the Studious Guy? And I said, pardon? And she goes, are you the Studious Guy? And I said, what do you mean? She goes, there's a guy near where I'm sitting that's just been reading the whole time. And I said, oh yeah, that would be me. And she goes, why are you doing that? And I said, well, I like to read, but I'm trying to learn. And she said, do you know how many videos there are that you could be watching? There are all these movies on the plane. I said, oh, I know there are movies, and I have nothing against watching movies. I'll watch movies. But I said, one thing I like to do is I like to read, and I can veg out and just watch these movies on the plane. I'm not sure they're going to leave me with much of an impact, right? And so, again, I don't mean this condescendingly, but the thought I had was, yeah, I could watch a bunch of movies. I'm on an 11-hour flight, plenty of time to watch movies. But I think one of the things that I just leave as an emphasis, perhaps, is I think what Cedar Fort does is important. I think books are important. I think learning is important. And sometimes I think in the world we spend too much time vegging or mindlessly surfing and there's places and times for that when, you've got a small window and you don't have something with you. But with the world that we're in with so much information and with this goal of wanting to get the celestial kingdom in a world that's ever increasingly moving away from spirituality and holy things, I think there's some real benefit in really analyzing how much time we spend studying things that will benefit us, increase our spirituality, make us more holy, make us more like God in Christ. And so I wasn't against anybody watching movies, and I didn't go on there thinking, I won't watch movies on the plane. Right. But I always take a couple of books with me, and it ended up, I just never turned on the TV on the plane because I was engaged in what I was reading. And I came out of that, at the end of it, I finished a couple of books on the trip, a couple of fairly long books. But as I closed the last volume that I was reading on the plane as we were getting close to Salt Lake, I remember thinking, the books that I read on this trip have really benefited me spiritually and have really affected the way I see things. That's a godsend. And to think Cedar Fort is producing these various volumes from different authors and in a variety of fields, but we're offering something to people to say, if you'll spend some time, a few hours with this publication, we're promising your life's going to be different. Being holy will be easier. Making the celestial kingdom will be more likely. The peace and the love that you're seeking will be more readily accessible. I wish we weren't losing that in society. And I worry that to some degree people are moving away from those important things that could be a blessing to them.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the things that we at Cedar Fort, we try to make sure we do well, and that is to make sure that you find you build the format of the product in whatever format the person's going to consume it in.
Yeah.
You know, whether it's through a hard copy book, an electronic book, an audio book, a podcast, a webinar, seminar, or even, I'll tell you, this will sound a little bit crazy. In fact, I laughed at it a little bit this week. But there's a company that's looking at working with us on some of our fiction titles, and it may apply in some other areas, but you can take the narrative and you put it into a group text format.
Oh, wow.
And I laughed at it until they had all this background data to show 27,000 students had already had licenses to it, and they're diving into that much more because the mind is easier for the younger generation. They compartmentalize their reading so much more than reading block text and deciphering what the block text is. Whether that's sad or not, because there's a portion of me that thinks, that's kind of sad. But the other side is, but we're reading so much more today than we ever have been before.
Yeah.
It's just not always in a book format.
Yeah.
And so as a publisher, we look at this and say, okay, well, at the end of the day, who are we really? Well, we're storytellers, we're educators, and we're entertainers. So how are we going to take that education or that entertainment and put it into a format that's easily consumable by those consumers? And if we can do that right, then there will always be a need for Cedar Fort. And I get passionate, as you had mentioned, with some of these things that Cedar Fort can do in the world. That, yeah, I truly feel humbled being part of this business, because I think that we play a slice of a part in preparing people for the second coming of the Savior. And that's meaningful to me. That's what drives me and gets me excited for this. But that's so important for us to make sure we're taking our content and making sure we're delivering it to the consumer in a way that's going to be consumed. And whether that's books, whether it's any of these other formats, that's not for me to decide.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I really appreciate the time that we've had to visit with you, to have you on the podcast. I'm happy for the opportunity that we've had to be able to meet together, and grateful for your time that you spent. I know I only called you a couple days ago, and here you are, and just off the cuff, we've been able to have this great dialogue. And hopefully we can be able to have you back in the future. We can go into some more depth on maybe specifically some of the titles that you have, and learn so much more that you have to be able to give to our listeners.
That would be fun to do. Bryce, thanks for your graciousness.
Thank you. Great to have you.